At 11:03 a.m., as the family of John James Hornezes Jr. gathered inside Destiny of Faith Church to say their final goodbyes, the solemn silence of the funeral was violently shattered. A burst of gunfire erupted outside, and the sound of screaming filled the air. Mourners scattered in every direction, desperately seeking cover. What was meant to be a quiet farewell quickly turned into a terrifying nightmare, with chaos consuming the scene. But even as the panic set in, the worst was yet to come. But this wasn't the first time John's name had been spoken that day, and it wouldn't be the last. Just days before, in a violent shootout at a gas station, his life had been stolen in an instant. What no one could have anticipated was that his death would set off a chain of events that turned into something far darker. The same community that mourned him now found itself gripped by even more violence, and the repercussions were only beginning to unfold. Outside the church, the gunfire continued. 6 people were wounded. A shooting that should have never happened during a moment of mourning had now escalated into a full-blown ambush. Why was the funeral site targeted? Who was behind the gunfire? How could such violence erupt in a place meant for peace and healing? As law enforcement rushed to respond, the investigation would reveal something far more troubling. A simple request for police protection had fallen through the cracks. Despite knowing the potential for violence, the officers assigned to provide security never showed up. The tragedy that unfolded outside the church was just the beginning. What followed would leave the community in shock, and the investigation mired in confusion and uncertainty. John James Hornezes Jr. was born in 2002, in the heart of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a city with grit, history, and neighborhoods that raised you as much as your parents did. He was a quiet kid to outsiders, but those who knew him saw something else entirely. John had a kind of calm strength that made people feel safe around him. He loved basketball. It wasn't just a hobby, it was his anchor. That game gave him rhythm, structure, and a sense of identity. On the court, he wasn't just another kid from the neighborhood. He was focused, locked in, and alive. Friends said he would shoot hoops for hours, whether there was a crowd or just the sound of sneakers and bouncing rubber echoing off a backboard. And when life threw things off balance, basketball pulled him back in. But there was more to him than a jump shot and a love for the game. John was the kind of person who would share his food if you were hungry, who'd check in on you if you were going through something, even if he was going through worse. His cousin once said, "If John had $2 and you had none, now you both had one." That's who he was. He went to school in Pittsburgh and tried to stay out of trouble, but the truth was, staying out of trouble wasn't always that simple. Not in a city where opportunities could be scarce, and the line between survival and self-destruction wasn't always clear. John wasn't perfect. He'd made mistakes. Still, growing up in Pittsburgh's North Side wasn't easy. There were pressures, gang activity, territorial tension, people with short tempers and long memories. And while John didn't go looking for trouble, it didn't always matter. The streets had a way of finding you. His family believed in him. They knew he was trying. His mother once told a neighbor, "John's heart is good. He just wants to live right. He just wants peace." And maybe that was the tragedy. He wasn't trying to be a legend, or a hero, or even famous. He just wanted a shot at something better. But none of that would matter on October 15th, 2022. Because on that day, John's story would be cut short in a way no one saw coming. And in the days that followed, the violence that claimed his life would keep spiraling until it reached the doors of the very church where his family tried to say goodbye. On the morning of October 15th, 2022, everything seemed ordinary. John James Hornezes Jr. had made plans to meet up with 2 of his close friends. They decided to hang out at the Sunoco gas station on Cedar Avenue, a place that John had frequented before. John and his friends, like any other young men, were killing time, talking about life, making plans, enjoying the simplicity of the moment. But then, everything changed in an instant. An SUV slowly rolled past them, and before anyone could even react, gunfire erupted from the street. Without any warning, John and his companions raised their weapons and opened fire. It was sudden, sharp, and brutal. However, they hadn't expected the SUV to fire back. What started as a one-sided attack turned into a full-fledged shootout, a back-and-forth exchange of deadly gunfire. In the chaos, Two innocent women, Betty Everett and Jacqueline Mahalik, who had simply been waiting at the bus stop, were caught in the crossfire. 1 minute, they were standing there, minding their own business, and the next, they were collapsing to the ground. The sound of gunfire had struck them both, and they were left there, victims of a violence they hadn't caused. Betty didn't survive the night. Her family, friends, and community were left shattered by the randomness of it all. Witnesses nearby were horrified, frozen in fear and confusion. They didn't know where to run, where to hide, or what to do. Some ducked behind cars, some found shelter behind gas pumps, and some just dropped to the ground, instinctively trying to shield themselves from the onslaught of bullets. It was chaos, pure and simple, a scene straight out of a nightmare, unfolding right in front of them. But the real heartbreak came when John, standing in the middle of it all, was struck by a bullet that was meant for someone else. As the firefight continued, a returned bullet from the SUV hit him, and he fell to the ground. His death wasn't immediate. He was found lying there, his handgun still by his side, a victim of a dispute he never started, caught in the crossfire of something much bigger than himself. His family, unaware at the time, would soon be dealing with a loss they couldn't possibly prepare for. Within moments of the shooting, 911 calls flooded dispatch centers, and officers rushed to the scene. By the time they arrived, it was clear. The gas station, once just a regular stop for commuters and locals, had turned into a crime scene. And not just any crime scene, a gruesome one. There were 3 fatalities, 2 innocent women and John, whose death would only be the beginning of a much larger story. The investigation began immediately. Police officers were met with the aftermath. Witnesses scattered, panicked, and the scene covered in blood. The detectives quickly pieced together the timeline and turned their focus on the individuals responsible. Within a few days, Sharon Troutman, a 19-year-old believed to be inside the SUV, was arrested. He faced homicide charges for the death of John Hornezes Jr., and his arrest marked the first step in what would become a lengthy investigation. But that wasn't all. Jalen Hines, a 21-year-old man who was injured in the shootout and was also standing alongside John, was charged with homicide for the deaths of Betty Everett and Jacqueline Mahalik. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. What started as a violent encounter at a gas station had turned into the tragic loss of multiple lives, and the community was left reeling. The investigation continued, but answers remained elusive, and the full impact of the violence was still unfolding. John's family had been utterly shattered by a sudden loss. They had hoped, in the midst of their grief, to find some semblance of peace in laying him to rest. But peace was not something they would be granted. Instead, the day that should have been a moment of closure, of saying goodbye with love, would become one of unimaginable horror. Just 2 weeks later, the funeral was set for October 28, 2022, at Destiny of Faith Church, a small, humble sanctuary nestled on Brighton Road in Pittsburgh. The church was filled with over 100 mourners, each struggling with their sorrow, offering prayers, and trying to make sense of the life that had been taken too soon. The air was thick with grief, the weight of loss hanging over every person who gathered. Yet, within that heavy silence, something else was quietly bubbling outside. At 11:03 a.m., just an hour and 20 minutes into the service, a single shot rang out, followed quickly by a second, then a burst of more shots. The sound echoed through the church, and in an instant, everything changed. By 11:04, the church was engulfed in complete chaos. Mourners, once seated quietly in their pews, now scrambled in every direction, trying to find shelter from the gunfire that was ripping through the air. Witnesses later described the horrific scene in vivid detail. "We heard bullets hitting the church doors. People dove under pews or ran for their lives. The sounds of terrified screams filled the air, mixing with the sound of gunshots as people rushed for safety, some with no idea where to go or how to escape. In the midst of the panic, the desperation in the eyes of the survivors was evident. The church, which had once been a place for comfort, was now a battleground. Those inside weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for their right to mourn. As the bullets continued to fly, 2 masked men, later identified as Hezekiah Nixon, 16, and Sean Davis, 19, approached the church. They didn't hesitate. There was no attempt to understand the setting, no pause to assess the situation. They simply opened fire. The shooters weren't targeting anyone specific. It didn't matter who they hit. Their aim seemed clear: cause as much damage as possible, spread terror, and disrupt the sacred moment that was meant to bring some peace to a grieving family. Surveillance footage from the area captured the shooters walking calmly across the street from the church, seemingly assessing the scene. The two men, dressed in dark clothes and wearing balaclavas to mask their identities, walked with guns in hand. They moved deliberately, as though they were waiting for the perfect moment. The footage showed them crossing the street slowly, almost methodically, positioning themselves for the attack they had planned. Then, with a sudden and devastating decision, they opened fire, letting loose a barrage of bullets aimed into the crowd of people who were already in the middle of mourning the loss of a loved one. The survivors, their hearts racing, would later recall the numbness that had gripped them as they tried to process what was happening. One woman, barely able to stand, was struck by a bullet and fell to the ground. Yet, in her desperation to survive, she tried to crawl to safety, her body weak, but her will to live stronger than anything else. The fear that spread through the church was palpable. It wasn't just about escaping the bullets, but also about how quickly everything had changed. The last place anyone thought they'd need to fear for their lives was at a funeral, in a house of worship. And yet there they were, trapped in the crossfire of a senseless attack. The gunmen continued their assault, seemingly with no regard for who they were hurting, only focused on carrying out their attack. Outside, the chaos continued, and inside, the horror was mounting. The peace that the family had desperately sought for John's final moments had been stolen in an instant. And the question that lingered in the air was the one that no one could answer. Why? Why was the church, a place of mourning and remembrance, turned into a target? The funeral had become a second crime scene, and the trauma would last far beyond the physical wounds inflicted that day. The aftermath of the funeral shooting was chaotic, but the investigation into the violent attack began immediately. 911 calls flooded dispatch within moments of the gunfire, with frantic voices reporting the shooting outside Destiny of Faith Church. Officers and first responders raced to the scene, their sirens piercing the air as they rushed to provide medical assistance. Ambulances arrived, and the wounded were quickly taken to nearby hospitals, some still fighting for their lives, others just beginning to process the violence they just endured. While 5 people survived their injuries, the community was left to pick up the pieces, knowing that what should have been a time of healing had turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. As the scene outside the church was processed, investigators turned their attention to piecing together what had happened. Surveillance footage from the area played a crucial role in reconstructing the events. The camera footage from the church and surrounding streets revealed something that would soon lead the authorities closer to the suspects. The video clearly showed 2 masked men, Hezekiah Nixon and Sean Davis, moving deliberately toward the church, and later, fleeing the scene in a black vehicle. The vehicle, a black sedan, was spotted leaving the area shortly after the shooting, and investigators wasted no time tracking its movements. Within hours, the vehicle was found abandoned in Brighton Heights, not far from where the chaos had erupted. The abandoned car became a crucial clue, and detectives now had a clearer path to follow. Nixon and Davis, the men captured on camera and believed to be the shooters, were now the prime suspects in the attack. The breakthrough came when law enforcement traced the vehicle's route and, after a few hours of intense searching, zeroed in on the McKees Rocks area, a short distance from the crime scene. Davis and Nixon were found attempting to flee, but the escape plan quickly fell apart. They got stuck in traffic, unable to outrun the pursuing officers. The situation went from desperate to futile within seconds as law enforcement closed in. The 2 suspects were arrested on the spot, just as they tried to make a run for it, but with no way out. Nixon and Davis were immediately taken into custody and faced a series of serious charges: attempted homicide, aggravated assault, and firearms violations. It was clear they weren't just responsible for the attack at the funeral, but their involvement in the earlier shootout at the gas station was now under further scrutiny. They were linked not just to one violent event, but 2, and both were charged with crimes that would carry heavy legal consequences. As the investigation progressed, John's family continued to grapple with the weight of the loss. But there was more than just grief on their minds. Retaliation had been a constant fear for them, and the events that led to the funeral shooting only amplified those concerns. In the days leading up to the funeral, John's family had made a formal request for police presence, fearing that the tensions surrounding his death might escalate further. Despite the family's worries, that request had gone unanswered. No officers showed up to provide the security they had asked for, and now, in the wake of the shooting, their fears had become a painful reality. And at the center of it all, Mayor Ed Gainey addressed the city, his voice filled with both sorrow and frustration. "This is senseless. This cannot be our future," he said, calling for an urgent change in how violence was dealt with in Pittsburgh. His words, though powerful, couldn't undo what had happened. The damage had already been done, and the emotional scars would take far longer to heal. The cycle of violence must be broken, people said, but the path forward remained uncertain. John's family and the community were left in the shadow of his death, still trying to find a way to heal. And as they searched for answers, the question remained, what would it take to finally end the violence and prevent another tragedy like this from occurring? If you want to know more about the investigation and what happens next, stay tuned for updates. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because justice isn't just a word. It's a fight for those who no longer have a voice.